Thwump, hiss, thwump, hiss. That's the rhythm of my life. It's the heartbeat of the kill floor. Or maybe, more accurately, it's the sound of heartbeat stopping. If you've never heard a pneumatic captive bolt pistol go off, count yourself lucky. It doesn't sound like a gun. A gun is an explosion, a crack of thunder that commands respect. A bolt gun is dismissive. It's a wet mechanical punch. It's the sound of a piston driving a steel rod 4 inches into a skull and retracting it faster than you can blink. It's the sound of a life being reduced to a product code in a fraction of a second. I worked the stun box at a processing plant just outside of Hastings, Nebraska. We don't have a fancy name for it, at least not one that we use on the floor. Locals call it the Iron Cathedral because of the way the smokestacks loom over the flat. Dead cornfields like Gothic spires, belching thick, white steam into the black sky. My job is simple. The cattle come down the chute, panicked, eyes rolling white, smelling the blood of the brother who went before them. They enter the restrainer, the sides clamped tight. I step up. I place the muzzle against the forehead, right at the intersection of the imaginary X drawn between the eyes and the ears. Thwump, the legs buckle. The eyes go vacant. The tongue lolls out. I release the side gate. The body slides onto the table, and the shackler chains the rear leg to hoist it up to the bleed rail. Next, it's repetitive. It's grueling. It pays $24 an hour, plus a night shift differential. In this part of the country, that's enough to keep you quiet about the smell that settles into your pores and never really washes out. You learn to dissociate. You stop seeing animals. You see units. You see tonnage, at least. That's how it usually goes. It was 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The graveyard shift is always weird. The circadian rhythm rebellion makes everyone a little hallucination prone. But this was different. The line had stopped moving. A jam up near the hide puller, probably. I was left standing there with a 1,400-pound Angus steer locked in the box. He was a big bastard, jet black, with a white patch on his nose that looked like a thumbprint. Usually, by the time they get to me, they're thrashing. They can smell the death. But this one was calm, eerily calm. He didn't struggle against the hydraulic clamps. He just stood there, his massive head lowered, watching me. Not watching the gun. Watching me, I wiped the sweat from my safety goggles and stepped up to the platform. "Sorry, buddy," I muttered. "It's a habit. A little prayer to the universe to keep my karma somewhat balanced." I raised the bolt gun. I lined it up. The steer blinked. Cows don't blink like that. They don't have the facial muscles for nuance. But this steer narrowed its eyes. A slow, deliberate squint. Then, he opened his mouth. He didn't moo. He didn't bellow. His jaw worked up and down, a wet, chewing motion, grinding his teeth together. The sound was like stones rubbing underwater. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the trigger. The steer craned his neck, pushing his wet nose right up against the steel mesh of the restrainer, inches from my face. "Run," the steer whispered. It wasn't a human voice. It was a guttural, wet rasp, shaped by a tongue that was too thick and vocal cords that weren't designed for speech. But the word was unmistakable. It hit me like a splash of ice water. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the grate. What the... Thwump. My finger had spasmed. The bolt fired into the empty air, the steel rod extending and snapping back with a useless hiss. The steer didn't flinch at the noise. He just kept staring at me with those dark, impossible eyes. And then he smiled. Have you ever seen a cow smile? Their lips aren't made for it. The skin pulled back too far, revealing too much gum, too many teeth. It was a rictus grin that stretched wider than the jawbone should allow. "Hey, Miller, stop playing with your food." The shout broke the spell. I snapped my head around to see Big Al, the floor foreman, storming down the catwalk. When I looked back at the box, the steer was just a steer again. It was thrashing now, kicking against the metal sides, eyes rolling in terrified panic. The smile was gone. The intelligence was gone. I shook my head, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was the fumes, the ammonia leak from last week, lack of sleep. I stepped up, hands shaking, and placed the muzzle. Thwump, the steer dropped. Just meat. Just units. But as the shackler hoisted him up, swinging that massive black carcass into the air, I watched the head dangle loosely, and I swear, as it spun slowly in the fluorescent light, one dead eye stayed locked on mine until it disappeared down the line. Thwump. Hiss. The rhythm started again, but the silence in between the beats. That's where the fear was starting to grow. Hastings, Nebraska, is a town that exists mostly to facilitate the movement of corn into cows, and cows into boxes. At night the town shrinks. The streetlights on Burlington Avenue hum over empty pavement, and the wind coming off the plains carries a bite that cuts right through your Carhartt jacket. But no matter where you are in town, if the wind is right, you can smell the plant. It's not just the smell of manure. It's deeper than that. It's the smell of hot copper, wet fur, and rendered fat. It's a thick, greasy scent that coats the back of your throat. My girlfriend, Sarah, left me 3 months ago because she said I tasted like iron when I kissed her. I scrubbed my skin raw with industrial degreaser, but she was right. You don't wash the iron cathedral off you. You just get used to it. The locker room at 3:30 a.m. is a study in purgatory. It's a long concrete room lined with dented gray lockers, filled with men who have stopped dreaming. We shuffle in silent ghosts in street clothes and transform into white-clad butchers. We pull on the rubber boots, the chainmail aprons, the hard hats. We wrap our wrists in tape to support the tendons that will be screaming by the end of the shift. Terry's a hierarchy here, unspoken but rigid. At the top is Big Al, Albert Kowalski. The man is a refrigerator with a mustache. Has been the night foreman for 30 years, and rumor has it has never taken a sick day. Al doesn't talk, he grunts. He communicates in pointed fingers and glares. He has hands the size of catcher's mitts, scarred and calloused, usually stained with something dark that he didn't bother to wash off. Al runs the floor like a prison warden. You don't ask Al questions. You just make sure your knife is sharp and your quota is met. Then there are the lifers, guys like me, Miller. We've been here long enough to know the rhythm, to know which machines have a temper, to know where the blind spots in the security cameras are. We keep our heads down. We count the hours until the sun comes up. And at the bottom are the new guys. Tonight, the new guy was Travis. Travis looked like he should be studying for a calculus exam, not gutting livestock. He was skinny, twitchy, with acne scars on his cheeks and eyes that darted around like a trapped rabbit. He'd been on the floor for 3 days, and he was already cracking. You hear that noise in the ventilation? Travis asked me as he struggled to tie his rubber apron. His voice was high, brittle. I slammed my locker shut. It's an old building, Travis. Pipes rattle. No, man, it's not rattling. He lowered his voice, leaning in closer. He smelled like cheap energy drinks in fear. It sounds like humming, like chanting, I sighed, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Look, kid, you're tired. The vibration of the rendering fans messes with your ears. It's called infrasound. It makes people paranoid. Just put your earplugs in and do the job. Travis didn't look convinced. He kept glancing at the door that led to the kill floor, his hands trembling as he pulled on his mesh gloves. I saw Al talking to the truck drivers earlier, he whispered. The ones who bring the special shipments around the back. They weren't speaking English, Miller, and they weren't speaking Spanish either. So, maybe they're Russian, or Polish. It didn't sound like a language, Travis insisted. It sounded like clicking. I froze. My mind flashed back to the steer in the stun box. The grinding teeth, the impossible whisper, run. I shook it off. I couldn't afford to let Travis' paranoia infect me. I had debts. I had a truck payment that was 2 months behind and a landlord who was losing patience. I needed this job. I needed to be steady. Travis, I said, grabbing his shoulder. His muscles were tight as wire. Listen to me, you want to survive the night shift. You stop asking questions. You stop listening to the pipes. You focus on the meat. That's it, meat in. Meat out. Don't make it complicated. Travis looked at me, his eyes wide and wet. I don't think it's just meat, Miller, he said softly. Before I could ask him what the hell that meant, the buzzer sounded. It was a harsh, jarring blare that signaled the start of the shift. The door to the floor swung open, and the roar of the machinery spilled into the locker room, the clanking chains, the hissing steam, the mechanical whine of the saws. Big Al stood in the doorway, blocking the light. He didn't say a word, he just jerked his thumb toward the kill floor. We filed out one by one into the belly of the beast. The air was hot and wet, thick with the smell of death. I put my earplugs in, drowning out the world. But as I walked past Al, I could have sworn he was smiling. Not a friendly smile. A smile like the steer, too wide, too knowing. I gripped my bolt gun tighter. Just another night in Hastings. Just another shift. I tried to believe that. I really did. The first hour of the shift was a blur of motion and noise. The adrenaline from my earlier hallucination had faded into a dull, throbbing headache behind my eyes. I was on autopilot load. Aim, fire, release. Load, aim, fire. Release. At the 4 a.m. break, the line halted for a 15-minute sanitization cycle. The high-pressure hoses hissed to life, blasting hot water and chemical foam over the blood-slicked concrete. I took the opportunity to head back to the locker room to grab some ibuprofen. The room was empty. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights was the only sound. I spun the combination on my lock 1832, 4, and yanked the metal door open. Something fluttered out. It was a piece of paper, laminated in cheap plastic, taped to the inside of my locker door. I frowned. I'd used this locker for 3 years. I knew every dent, every rust spot, every sticky residue mark from stickers I'd peeled off. This hadn't been there yesterday. I peeled it off. The tape was fresh. The paper was plain white, standard printer stock, with no company letterhead. No USDA logo. No OSHA warnings. Just a list. Typed in bold, sans serif font. Updated protocols for night shift personnel. Do not acknowledge livestock that attempt to make eye contact for longer than 5 seconds. If the steam from the scalding tank turns green, hold your breath immediately and evacuate the floor until the ventilation cycles. Approx. 3 mins. Do not report this as a chemical leak. Ignore any livestock found in Pen 4. Pen 4 is currently under maintenance. It is empty. If you see movement in Pen 4, you are mistaken. Do not speak to the drivers of the unmarked black trucks. Do not assist them with unloading. Do not look into the ventilation slats of their trailers. If you hear your name called from the drainage grates, do not answer. It is just the echo. The animals are processed regardless of vocalization. Do not hesitate. I read it twice, then a third time. What the hell is this? I muttered. It had to be a joke. One of the day shift guys messing with the night crew. It was a classic hazing ritual scare. The sleep-deprived zombies with ghost stories. But it didn't feel like a joke. The tone was too clinical, too dry. And rule number 1, do not acknowledge livestock that attempt to make eye contact. I thought of the steer. The way it had looked at me, the way it had smiled. A heavy hand landed on my shoulder. I jumped, spinning around. Big Al was standing there. I hadn't heard him come in. For a man of his size, he moved with terrifying silence. He smelled of bleach and raw meat. What you got there, Miller? His voice was a gravelly rumble, low and dangerous. I held up the sheet. Found this in my locker. Some kind of joke. Ellis' eyes dropped to the paper. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He reached out and snatched the paper from my hand. He didn't crumble it. He folded it neatly, carefully, and slid it into the pocket of his blood-stained smock. Not a joke, Al said. Then what is it? If the steam turns green. Al, that sounds like a chlorine leak. That's illegal. Al took a step closer. He loomed over me, blocking out the light from the hallway. His eyes were hard, flat discs of flint. It's protocol, Miller. You've been here long enough to know we do things different at night. The plant. It has quirks. Quirks Rule 5 says not to answer if the drains call my name. That's not a quirk, Al. That's insanity. Al leaned in. His face inches from mine. I could see the broken capillaries in his nose, the gray stubble on his chin. You want to keep getting that night differential. You want to pay off that truck. Yeah, but then you follow the list, Al growled. You don't ask questions. You don't go looking in Pen 4. And you sure as hell don't talk about this to the day crew, you understand. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked away, his heavy boots thudding against the concrete. At the doorway, he paused, but didn't look back. And Miller, "Yeah, check your earplugs. Make sure they're tight. The drains are loud tonight." He disappeared into the hallway. I stood there, staring at the empty space where he had been, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my earplugs. They were standard yellow foam. I rolled them between my fingers, compressing them tight. I shoved them into my ears, deeper than I ever had before. I wasn't laughing at Travis anymore. By 5 a.m., the air in the plant had changed. The humidity had spiked, turning the kill floor into a sauna of bloody mist. My goggles kept fogging up, forcing me to wipe them every few minutes with a greasy rag. I was on break again, standing by the loading dock doors, trying to inhale as much freezing Nebraska air as my lungs could hold. The cold burned, but it felt clean. It felt real. "Miller," I jumped, dropping my cigarette. It was Travis. He was huddled against the brick wall, shivering violently, though I didn't think it was just from the cold. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy. "Jesus, kid, don't sneak up on me," I snapped, bending to retrieve my smoke. "I went," Travis whispered. "I went to look." "Look at what?" "Pen 4, my stomach tightened. I thought about the laminated list. "Pen 4 is currently under maintenance. It is empty." "Travis, you idiot. Al told us to stay away from there." "I had to know, man," Travis said, his voice trembling. I was walking past the holding chutes to get to the bathroom. The maintenance gate was open. Just a crack. I peeked inside. I looked around to make sure we were alone. The loading dock was deserted, save for a few empty trailers parked in the yard. "And," I asked, hating myself for asking, "was it empty?" Travis shook his head slowly. Number, it wasn't empty. But there weren't any cows in there either. He pushed off the wall and grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Come look, please, Miller. I need you to tell me I'm crazy. If I'm crazy, I can go home. I can quit. But if I'm not," I should have said no. I should have told him to go back to work. I should have remembered rule number 3. But curiosity is a disease, and I was already infected. "Fine," I hissed, quickly. "If Al catches us, we're fired." We slipped back inside, avoiding the main floor. We took the catwalks that ran above the holding pens, moving through the shadows like thieves. The smell up here was overpowering, a concentrated stench of ammonia, and fierce sweat rising from the animals below. We reached the section marked Pen 4. The gate was indeed chained shut, with a heavy padlock, and a sign that read "Maintenance, do not enter." But Travis led me to a gap in the corrugated metal siding, a place where the rust had eaten away a hole just big enough to see through. "Look," Travis whispered. I leaned in, pressing my eye to the cold metal. The pen was large, maybe 50 feet square, with concrete walls that were higher than the other pens. There was no straw bedding, no feed troughs. The floor was bare concrete, scrubbed impeccably clean, except for the paint. The floor was covered in symbols. They were painted in a thick, luminescent red substance that I prayed was paint, but knew was blood. They weren't graffiti tags. They looked geometric, interlocking circles, triangles, and strange. Jagged script that hurt my eyes just to look at. They pulsed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the pen, there was a single trough. It wasn't filled with grain or water. It was filled with a thick, greenish liquid that bubbled sluggishly. A heavy mist rolled off the surface, clinging to the floor like dry ice. "See?" Travis breathed. "What kind of maintenance is that?" "Maybe they're resurfacing the floor," I said weakly, trying to rationalize the irrational. "Those symbols, maybe they're markings for pipes or electrical lines." "Bullshit, Miller. Look at the trough." I looked closer. The bubbling liquid shifted. Something surfaced for a brief second before sinking back down. It looked like a hand. Not a cow's hoof, a hand. Pale, bloated, with long, spindly fingers. I jerked back from the hole, my heart hammering against my ribs. Okay, that's weird. We're leaving. Now, weird. Travis grabbed my collar, his face twisted in hysteria. That was a hand, Miller. A human hand. What are they feeding them? What is this place? Keep your voice down, I shoved him back. We don't know what that was. It could have been a glove. A rubber glove floating in cleaner fluid. It had fingernails. Travis shrieked. A metallic clang echoed through the catwalk. We both froze. Down below, at the far end of the corridor, a door had opened. Heavy footsteps reverberated on the metal grating. "Big Al, run," I whispered. We scrambled back the way we came. Ducking low, our boots slipping on the greasy grate. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if Al had seen us. I didn't want to know what he would do if he caught us staring into the abyss of Pen 4. We made it back to the kill floor just as the buzzer sounded to end the break. We split up without a word, taking our places on the line. I picked up my bolt gun. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Thwump. Hiss. The cattle kept coming. But now, every time I looked into their eyes, I didn't just see fear. I saw the symbols from Pen 4 burning in their retinas. And I wondered what exactly I was sending down the line to be eaten. The paranoia was settling in now, heavy and suffocating like a lead blanket. Every shadow on the kill floor seemed to stretch a little too far. Every mechanical groan of the conveyor belt sounded like a moan. Travis was stationed down the line at the evisceration table. I kept stealing glances at him. He was pale as a sheet, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He nicked the stomach of a carcass twice, spilling bile onto the floor, earning a sharp reprimand from the line supervisor. But Travis didn't even flinch. He just kept staring at the back door. At 5:45 a.m., the back door opened. We weren't expecting a delivery. The schedule board was blank until the morning shift arrived at 7 o'clock. But the bay doors rumbled open, letting in a blast of frigid air and the blinding glare of headlights. 2 trucks backed into the receiving bay. They weren't the usual livestock haulers, those rattling. Aluminum cattle pots with ventilation holes punched in the sides. These were black, matte black, with no dot numbers, no company logos, and no license plates. They looked like armored bank trucks, but bigger, much bigger. I was positioned near the stun box, which gave me a direct line of sight through the heavy plastic strip curtains into the receiving bay. I knew I should look away. Rule number 4, do not speak to the drivers. Do not look into the ventilation slats. But I couldn't help myself. I turned my body slightly, pretending to adjust the pressure gauge on my bolt gun, and watched. The drivers climbed out. They weren't wearing trucker flannels and jeans. They were wearing full-body hazmat suits bright orange, with respirators covering their faces. They moved with military precision, checking the perimeter of the trucks before signaling to someone in the shadows. Big Al stepped out of the darkness. He walked right up to the lead driver. They didn't shake hands. The driver handed Al a clipboard. Al signed it without reading it. Then they opened the back of the trucks. There was no ramp. Instead, a hydraulic lift lowered a large metal crate onto the concrete. It was solid steel, with small reinforced viewing ports near the top. It was silent. Usually, when you unload cattle, Therese noise bellowing, hooves clattering, the sound of animals in distress. But this crate was dead quiet. Al banged on the side of the crate with his fist. 2 sharp raps. From inside, something slammed against the metal wall. It was a heavy, dull thud, powerful enough to rock the crate on its casters. Then came the sound. It wasn't a moo. It wasn't a grunt. It was a chittering noise, like 1,000 insects rubbing their legs together, but amplified, deep and resonant. Click, 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 hiss. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. That sound. It vibrated in my teeth. The hazmat drivers hooked the crate to a forklift and began moving it. Not toward the holding pens, not toward the kill line. They were taking it toward the freight elevator that led to the sub-basement. The rendering plant. The rendering plant is where the waste goes. Bones, blood, fat. Intestines, everything that can't be sold as meat gets cooked down into tallow and meal. It's the hottest, foulest place in the factory. No one goes down there unless they have to. As the forklift turned, the crate tilted slightly, for a split second. Through one of the reinforced viewing ports, I saw movement. It was a face. Pressed against the thick glass was a patch of skin. It was gray, translucent, and wet. And then, an eye rolled into view. It wasn't a cow's eye. It had a vertical slit pupil, like a goat or a reptile, surrounded by sclera that was a sickly, glowing yellow. It blinked, once, twice, and then a long, spindly hand with too many joints slapped against the glass, creating a smear of dark fluid. The forklift disappeared into the elevator. The doors clanged shut. I stood frozen, the bolt gun hanging limp in my hand. "Miller," the supervisor shouted, snapping his fingers in front of my face. "Wake up. You got cattle backing up." I shook my head, snapping back to reality. The line was moving again. A Hereford steer was in the stun box, looking at me with terrified, normal cow eyes. I raised the gun. Thwump. But my mind was down in the sub-basement. I knew what the rendering plant smelled like. It smelled like burning fat. But tonight, as the elevator descended, a new smell began to drift up through the ventilation grates. It was sweet, sickly sweet, like rotting flowers and ozone, and the chittering sound, click, 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 was starting to echo through the pipes. We weren't processing cattle anymore. I didn't know what those things were, but I knew one thing for sure. They weren't meant to be eaten. They were meant to be hidden. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't you just leave? It's the question everyone asks when they hear stories like this. When the horror starts, when the impossible bleeds into the mundane. Why doesn't the protagonist just drop their tools, walk out the door, and never look back? The answer is always the same. We are trapped, not by locked doors or razor wire, but by the invisible chains of life. I have $42,000 in student loan debt for a degree in graphic design that isn't worth the paper it's printed on. I have a 2018 Ford F-150 that I bought when I thought I was going to be a contractor, which is now underwater on payments. I have a gambling habit that I keep telling myself is under control, even though my bookie, a guy named Sal who operates out of a laundromat in Omaha, has started asking about my kneecaps. But mostly, it's my dad. Pop is in a nursing home in Lincoln. It's a nice place. Not the best, but not one of those state-run hellholes where they leave you in soiled sheets for 12 hours. It costs $5,000 a month. Pop's pension covers 2. The rest comes from me. He has dementia. Some days he thinks I'm his brother. Some days he thinks I'm a stranger trying to steal his wallet. But every once in a while, the fog lifts, and he looks at me with those watery blue eyes and says, "I'm proud of you, son. You're a good man." I live for those moments. They are the fuel that gets me out of bed at 8 p.m. They are the reason I can stand in a river of blood for 10 hours a night and wash the smell of death out of my hair every morning. If I quit this job, Pop goes to the state home. He dies alone, scared and confused. If I quit this job, Sal comes looking for his money. If I quit this job, I lose the only thing holding my pathetic, crumbling life together. So, I stay. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling inside the mesh gloves. The knuckles were scarred, the skin raw from the chemicals. These weren't the hands of an artist anymore. They were the hands of a killer, a machine. "Miller," I whispered to myself, a mantra I repeated a dozen times a night. "Just make it to 7 a.m. Just get the check." I looked over at Travis. He didn't have a sick dad. He didn't have a bookie. He was just a kid trying to save up for a motorcycle. He had options. He could walk away. I saw him staring at the emergency exit sign, the red letters glowing like a beacon in the steam-filled haze. I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was going to run. A pang of jealousy hit me so hard it almost doubled me over. I wanted to run with him. I wanted to burst through those doors and sprint into the cornfields until my lungs burned. But then I thought of Pop. I thought of the way his hands shook when he tried to use a spoon. I sighed, the breath hitching in my throat. I turned back to the stun box. The next steer was waiting thwump. I stay because I have to, and that, in its own way, is more terrifying than any monster in the basement. Because the monsters might kill you, but the debt owns you while you're still alive. I wiped a splatter of blood from my cheek. Just 3 more hours. I can do 3 more hours, or so I thought. Suddenly, the overhead conveyor belt screeched to a halt. The alarm a deafening, rhythmic klaxon began to blare. The red strobe lights mounted on the ceiling started to flash, bathing the kill floor in a pulsing bloody glow. System failure grinder 3. The intercom crackled. Miller. We got a jam in the rendering intake. Get down there and clear it now. My stomach dropped, rendering the sub-basement. Where the black trucks went, I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse. But I thought of the $5,000 due on the 1st of the month. Copy, I said into my radio. On my way, I grabbed my toolkit and walked toward the freight elevator, leaving the safety of the line behind. I was descending into the belly of the beast, and I had a terrible feeling I wasn't coming back up the same man. The freight elevator ride down to the sub-basement felt like descending into the throat of a dying animal. The air grew hotter, thicker, and heavier with every foot we dropped. By the time the metal grate rattled open, the smell hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just the usual rendering smell, that cloying, burnt popcorn scent of cooking tallow. It was sharper, metallic, like a mouthful of old pennies mixed with ozone. I stepped out onto the metal walkway. The sub-basement was a labyrinth of pipes, steam vents, and massive vibrating machinery. In the center of the room sat the grinder, a towering industrial shredder, the size of a dump truck. Its purpose was to take the waste bone and cartilage, and pulverize it into meal. Usually, the grinder roared with a deafening, bone-shaking rumble. But now, it was silent, or mostly silent. A low electrical hum emanated from the machine, accompanied by a rhythmic thud-thud. Thud from deep within its hopper. It sounded like a giant heart beating inside a metal ribcage. The red emergency light pulsed above the maintenance hatch. Jam detected. I walked toward it, my boots sticking to the greasy floor. I checked the lockout-togout station. The power was cut. The safety padlock was in place. The machine shouldn't be able to turn on. It was safe. So why were my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my wrench? I climbed the ladder to the access platform. The hopper was filled with a gruesome slurry of partially processed waste skulls, ribs, hooves, all tumbled together in a gray, bony soup. I shined my flashlight into the throat of the machine. The twin auger blades, massive, spiraling screws of hardened steel, were jammed. Something was wedged between the teeth of the left screw. It didn't look like bone. It gleamed in the beam of my light. I reached for the grabber tool, a long metal claw we used to clear blockages without sticking our hands in. I maneuvered it down into the hopper, aiming for the obstruction. Clink, the tool struck the object. It was hard. Metal. I clamped the jaw shut and pulled. It was stuck tight. I braced my feet against the railing and heaved. With a sucking sound, the object broke free from the slurry. I lifted it up, bringing it into the light. It wasn't a piece of machinery that had fallen in. It wasn't a tool. It was a prosthetic leg. A high-tech, carbon fiber prosthetic, complete with a titanium knee joint, and a sneaker still laced onto the foot. The sneaker was a bright neon green Nike. I stared at it, my brain trying to process the impossible. Cows don't wear Nikes. Cows don't have titanium knees. I dropped the leg on the grating clang. I shined the light back into the hole. Now that the obstruction was cleared, the slurry shifted. Something else rolled over in the mix. A face. It wasn't a cow. It wasn't a pig. It was human, or at least it had been. It was a man, his skin gray and bloated, eyes wide and staring. But there were additions. His jaw had been wired shut with silver brackets. His forehead had been modified. Implants under the skin formed strange geometric ridges. And on his neck, branded into the flesh, was a barcode, not a tattoo. A brand, seared into the skin. I retched, stumbling back. My flashlight beam swung wildly across the room, and then the grinder turned on. There was no warning klaxon, no startup sequence, just a sudden, violent roar as the augers engaged. The safety padlock was still on the switch. The power was cut. It was impossible, but the machine didn't care about impossible. It roared to life, the blades churning the slurry. The man's face was pulled down into the teeth. There was a wet, sickening crunch as the skull was crushed, followed by the grinding snap of bone. "Help me." The voice didn't come from the hopper. It came from inside the machine. From below the blades. "Miller, help." It sounded like Travis. I froze. Travis! I screamed over the roar of the engine. Get me out. It burns. It burns. I scrambled down the ladder, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. I ran to the inspection port at the base of the machine, where the processed meal came out. I yanked a lever opening the hatch. A wave of steam and hot, gray sludge poured out onto the floor. But mixed in with the meal were things, not bone shards jewelry. A gold wedding band, a silver locket, a pair of glasses. The lenses cracked. And then, tumbling out of the chute, came a hand. It was severed at the wrist. It was twitching, the fingers curled and uncurled, clawing at the concrete floor. On the ring finger was a class ring. Hastings High School, class of 2022. That was Travis' ring. He had shown it to me just 3 hours ago. I stared at the hand. It actually crawled, pulling itself across the greasy floor toward my boot. I kicked it away, screaming. I scrambled backwards, slipping in the sludge. The grinder roared louder, the pitch rising to a scream. The lights in the sub-basement flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The only light came from the emergency strobes, painting the room in flashes of blood red. And in the strobes I saw them, standing in the shadows between the pipes and the boilers, dozens of them. Figures, not men, not animals. They were hunched over, their limbs too long, their skin pale and wet. They wore the shreds of hazmat suits, and they were all watching me. One of them stepped forward. It had the face of the man I had seen in the hopper. The crushed skull was reforming, the bone knitting itself back together with a wet, grinding sound. It opened its mouth, the wired jaw snapping the silver brackets. "Run, Miller," it gargled. "Run while you still have legs." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and sprinted for the elevator, abandoning my tools, abandoning my logic, abandoning everything except the primal need to survive. Behind me, the grinder chewed, and the things in the dark began to laugh. Click, 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 hiss. I smashed the call button for the elevator, my fist bruising against the metal. Come on, I whimpered. The sound of my own voice was pathetic, small against the encroaching mechanical roar from the darkness behind me. The elevator rattled down. The doors groaned open. I threw myself inside and jammed the button for the main floor. As the doors began to slide shut, I saw movement in the gap. A shadow, long and impossibly fast, skittered across the walkway where I had just been standing. A clawed hand reached for the closing doors, scratching against the metal with a shriek of steel on steel. Thud. The doors sealed. The elevator lurched upward. I slumped against the wall, gasping for air. My mind was fracturing. Travis' ring. The prosthetic leg. The things in the shadows. It couldn't be real. It was the fumes. It had to be the fumes. The elevator dinged, main floor. I stumbled out into the kill floor. It was eerily quiet. The main lights were still on up here, buzzing their oppressive fluorescent hum. The line was stopped. No workers were visible. The carcasses hung motionless on the rail, dripping blood onto the silent concrete. "Travis," I screamed. "Travis, where are you?" If his hand was in the grinder, no. Number that wasn't real. I ran toward the evisceration station where Travis had been working. It was abandoned. His knife was still on the cutting board, stuck deep into a piece of liver. His apron lay on the floor in a crumpled heap, but there was a trail. Footprints, bloody, barefoot footprints leading away from the station. They didn't lead toward the locker room. They led toward the emergency exit at the far end of the hall. I sprinted, following the red marks. "Travis, wait." I burst through the double doors onto the loading dock. The cold wind hit me instantly, drying the sweat on my face. The loading yard was empty. The black trucks were gone. The security gate was closed. But halfway across the asphalt, under the harsh glare of a sodium floodlight, stood Travis. He was naked. He had stripped off his uniform, his boots, everything. He was standing in the freezing cold, shivering so violently his knees were knocking together. He was staring up at the smokestack of the rendering plant. "Travis," I yelled, running toward him. "We have to go. We have to get the police." He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge me. He just kept staring up at the smoke, billowing into the night sky. "It's not smoke, Miller," he whispered as I grabbed his arm. His skin was ice cold. "It's souls, can't you see them? Travis, snap out of it. We're leaving." "I can't leave," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I signed the paper. Rule number 6, do not hesitate. "What are you talking about?" He turned to look at me. His eyes were gone. Not gouged out, just gone. The sockets were empty, smooth skin where the eyes should have been, as if they had never existed. But he was crying. Tears of blood leaked from the corners of the sealed flesh. "They took my eyes so I wouldn't see the truth," he murmured. "But I can still hear it. The grinder, it's hungry, Miller." Before I could react, the floodlights cut out. The yard plunged into darkness. A siren wailed, not a police siren, but the plant's air raid siren, a sound usually reserved for tornadoes. From the darkness near the gate, a pair of headlights flared to life, high beams blindingly bright. A truck engine roared. "Run, Travis." I pulled at him. But he was rooted to the spot. "No," he said softly. "I'm already processed." The truck accelerated, tires squealed on asphalt. I dove to the side, rolling onto the frozen gravel. The truck didn't swerve. It didn't brake. It plowed straight into Travis with a sickening, meaty thud. I screamed his name, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the engine. The truck didn't stop. It circled around the lot, aiming its headlights at me, and standing in the open doorway of the plant. Silhouetted by the red emergency lights from inside, stood Big Al. He wasn't running to help. He wasn't calling 911. He was holding a high-pressure hose, and he was casually washing a smear of red grease off the door handle. He looked at me, lying in the dirt, and raised a hand. He pointed one thick finger at the truck, then at me. "You're next." I scrambled to my feet. The sirens weren't coming to save me. The police weren't coming. I was alone, and the shift wasn't over yet. I scrambled back inside the plant, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind me. I threw the deadbolt, my hands shaking so violently, I nearly missed the latch. Outside, the truck slammed into the metal door with a deafening clang, buckling the steel plate inward. A second impact followed, then the grinding sound of a bumper pressing against the frame. They were trying to ram it down. I backed away, hyperventilating. The loading dock was a dead end. I had to get through the kill floor to the front offices. Maybe I could break a window. Maybe I could find a landline. Suddenly, the main overhead lights, the buzzing fluorescence that had been my only comfort, flickered and died. Total blackness. For 5 heartbeats, I stood in absolute dark, the silence of the plant heavy and suffocating. Then, the backup generators kicked in with a low electrical hum. The emergency lights bathed the world in crimson. It wasn't a steady light. It was a rotating strobe, sweeping across the vast, cavernous room like the eye of a lighthouse from hell. Red, dark, red, dark. The shadows seemed to jump with every pass of the light. The carcasses hanging on the bleed rail looked like suspended corpses, swaying gently in the draft. Click! The sound came from the control booth overlooking the floor. It was the sound of a PA system turning on. "Attention, personnel." A voice crackled. It wasn't Al. It was a synthesized, robotic voice. "Production quotas have not been met. Initiating overtime protocols. All biological assets to the processing line." Hum clank. The conveyor belts roared to life. The chains on the ceiling track began to rattle. The carcasses started to move. At first, I thought it was just the momentum of the machinery dragging them forward. But then, under the strobe of the red light, I saw it. The steer closest to me, a massive, headless carcass that had been gutted an hour ago, jerked. Its legs kicked out, spasming violently. Galvanism, I told myself. Residual nerve impulses. But then it reached out. The front leg, stripped of its hoof, hooked around the metal stanchion of the platform. The muscles flexed, dark and raw without skin. The carcass pulled itself up, fighting against the gravity of the hook. I stumbled back, tripping over a mop bucket. Clatter crash. The noise echoed like a gunshot. Every carcass on the line stopped swaying. Slowly in unison they turned. Without heads, without eyes, they oriented themselves toward the sound. Toward me, oh God, I whimpered. The headless steer ripped itself free from the shackle. It hit the floor with a wet slap sound. It didn't collapse, it stood, unshaky, Skinless legs, it stood up. And then it screamed. It didn't have a throat, but the sound tore out of its open chest cavity a wet, gurgling shriek that sounded like a man drowning in oil. Then another one dropped, and another. They were coming off the line. A dozen of them, 2 dozen. They began to shamble toward me. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like puppets being pulled by invisible strings. Their hooves clicked on the concrete. Click, click, click. I turned and ran. I sprinted past the evisceration tables, dodging the swinging hooks. Behind me, the sound of wet footsteps grew louder. A stampede of the dead. I aimed for the hallway leading to the offices, but a metal gate slammed down in front of me, sparks flying as it hit the concrete. Security lockdown active. I spun around. They were gaining on me. The lead steer lunged, its raw shoulder slamming into a stainless steel table, knocking it aside like it was made of cardboard. I ducked into the only open room nearby, the hide room. This was where the skins were salted and stacked. I slammed the door and braced a heavy salt barrel against it. Thud. Something heavy hit the door. The wood groaned. Thud. Open up, Miller, a voice gurgled from the other side. I froze. It wasn't the steer. It sounded like Travis, but distorted. Wrong. Like his voice was being played backward and then forward again. We just want to talk to you about your extended warranty, the voice giggled. Then it shifted pitch, dropping an octave. We want to peel you, Miller. We want to see what color you are underneath. I backed away, deeper into the room. The hide room was filled with pallets of salted skins. The smell was intense brine and decay. I hid behind a stack of pallets, crouching in the dark, clutching my bolt gun like a talisman. The pounding on the door stopped. Silence. Then, from the ventilation grate above my head, I heard a sound. Scritch, scritch. I looked up, in the red pulse of the emergency light filtering through the fan blades. I saw fingers, long, pale fingers poking through the mesh. They gripped the metal grate and pulled. With a screech of tearing metal, the grate was ripped from the ceiling. It crashed to the floor. A face peered down at me from the vent. It was upside down. It was Travis' face. But the skin had been peeled back from his skull, pinned in place like a surgical diagram. His empty eye sockets stared directly at me. Found you? The thing wearing Travis' face whispered. It began to squeeze itself through the hole, its limbs bending at impossible angles, dislocating shoulders and hips to fit. It dripped a thick black fluid onto the floor next to me. I didn't wait. I bolted from my hiding spot, kicking the salt barrel away from the door. I threw it open and ran back out onto the kill floor. The herd of skinless cattle was waiting. But they weren't attacking. They had formed a circle, a semicircle around the stun box, and standing in the center of the circle, holding a captive bolt gun that looked like it had been modified with glowing green tubes, stood Big Al. He wasn't wearing his hard hat anymore, and I realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that the top of his head wasn't a skull. It was clear glass, and inside, where his brain should have been, something dark and writhing was pulsing with light. Shift's not over, Miller, Al boomed. Get back on the line. I didn't answer Al. I didn't wait for the skinless cattle to close the circle. I did the only thing a sane rat does when cornered by a cat. I went for the sewer. I threw myself sideways, sliding across the blood-slicked floor, like a baseball player stealing home, aiming for the drainage trench that ran beneath the conveyor belts. It was a narrow, foul-smelling gutter designed to carry away blood and offal, covered by heavy iron grates. But the maintenance hatch near the stun box was loose. I knew it because I'd tripped over it 100 times. I kicked the hatch open and dropped into the trench. It was a tight squeeze. The muck came up to my knees, a warm, viscous slurry of congealed blood and fat. I gagged, pulling the grate back over my head, just as a hoof slammed down on the metal bars. Above me, the kill floor erupted into chaos. The sound of hooves clattering on concrete, the roar of Al shouting orders, and the mechanical whine of his modified bolt gun echoed through the grate. I crawled. The crawl space under the floor was a nightmare of pipes and dripping condensation. The only light came in slivers from the red emergency strobes filtering down through the grates above, painting the sludge in horrific, flashing patterns. I made my way toward the freezer lockers on the north side of the plant. The walls there were thicker, insulated, Maybe I could hide. Maybe I could find a vent that led outside. As I crawled, the sounds changed. The clattering hooves faded, replaced by a rhythmic thumping directly above my head. Thump. Drag, thump. Drag. And then, the voices started. At first, I thought it was the pipes again. The infrasound Travis had warned me about. But this wasn't a hum. It was distinct, articulate. Help me. The voice drifted down through a grate to my left. It sounded like an old woman. Please, it's cold. Why is it so cold? I froze, holding my breath. I looked up through the slats of the grate. I saw hooves. Just cow hooves. But the voice was coming from the animal. They took my baby, another voice cried out. This one deeper, guttural. They put him in the grinder. It wasn't just one or two. It was a chorus. A cacophony of human misery rising from the throats of the livestock above. Some were weeping. Some were praying. Some were just screaming. A high, thin sound that vibrated the iron bars. Our Father who art in heaven. A steer prayed directly above me. Miller, a voice whispered. I stopped dead. That wasn't a random cry. That was my name. I looked up. A face was pressed against the grate. It wasn't a cow. It was Travis. Or rather, the thing wearing Travis' skin. It was lying on the floor, staring down at me through the bars. Its empty eye sockets seemed to bore into my soul. It's nice down there, isn't it, Miller? The thing hissed. Warm, wet, just like the womb. I scrambled backward, splashing through the muck. Don't run, Miller. We just want you to join the herd. It's peaceful. No more debt. No more sick dad. Just the line. The eternal line. I squeezed my eyes shut and crawled faster, my elbows scraping raw against the concrete. He's going to find you, Travis sang-songed. And he has a special hook just for you. I reached the end of the trench. A ladder led up into the blast freezer anteroom. I scrambled up, pushing the access panel open. I tumbled out onto the cold tile floor, gasping for clean air. I was in the freezer prep area. Rows of hanging carcasses skinned, headless, and frozen solids stretched out into the dark, foggy distance. The temperature was 20 below zero. I stood up, shivering as the muck on my clothes began to freeze instantly. The door to the kill floor burst open. Big Al stood there. He filled the frame, his silhouette backlit by the red emergency lights. The green tubes on his bolt gun hummed with power. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just walked into the freezer, his heavy boots crunching on the frost. He stopped 10 feet away from me. He reached up and tapped the glass dome of his skull. The dark thing inside pulsed. You broke the rules, Miller, Al said. His voice was calm, almost sad. You looked in Pen 4, you talked to the drivers. You listened to the drains. He raised the gun. Now we have to process you. I looked around for a weapon, a meat hook, a knife, anything. My hand brushed against a hanging carcass. It was frozen rock hard. What are you? I screamed, backing away. Al smiled. We are the supply chain, Miller. We feed the things that feed on you. He pulled the trigger, a bolt of green energy, not steel, shot from the gun. It missed my head by an inch, slamming into the frozen carcass beside me. The meat exploded, shattering like glass. I turned and ran into the maze of frozen beef. The mist swallowing me whole, behind me. I heard Alice's heavy footsteps, slow and steady, and all around me the frozen carcasses began to twitch. The ice cracked as they tried to move, even frozen, even dead. They were still part of the herd, and the herd obeyed the butcher. The freezer was a forest of dead meat. The hanging sides of beef were spaced 2 feet apart, creating a claustrophobic labyrinth of fat and frozen muscle. The mist from the cooling unit swirled around my ankles, thick and white, obscuring the floor. I sprinted down the aisles, weaving between the carcasses. Every time I brushed against one, it swayed, creating a domino effect of clicking hooks that echoed through the vast icy chamber. Clink, clink, clink. You can't hide in the cold, Miller. ALS voice boomed, bouncing off the metal walls. I can see your heat signature. I dove behind a pallet of boxed ribs, my breath coming in jagged white puffs. I tried to control my breathing, to stop the shivering that was racking my body. The muck on my clothes had frozen into a stiff, stinking armor that cracked every time I moved. I peeked around the corner. Al was walking down the center aisle. He didn't look left or right. He held the modified bolt gun in one hand, and in the other he held a datapad. He glanced at the screen, then turned abruptly toward my aisle. He could see my heat. I scrambled back, looking for a way out. The freezer had two exits, the main door I came in, which Al was blocking, and the loading dock access at the far end. That was my goal, but between me and the exit stood 50 yards of swaying, frozen meat. I started to move, staying low. As I passed the side of beef, a hand shot out. It burst from the frozen chest cavity of the cow, punching through the ribs. It was blue with cold, the fingers stiff and claw-like. It grabbed my jacket. I yelped, spinning around. The frozen carcass shuddered. A face pressed against the translucent membrane of fat covering the ribs. It was a human face, frozen in a silent scream, trapped inside the meat. Help! The frozen lips formed the word, though no sound came out. I ripped my jacket free, the fabric tearing. Al fired Zest. The green energy bolt slammed into the pallet of ribs right next to my head. The cardboard box disintegrated, showering me in bone dust and frozen pork. Stop running, Al roared. Accept your promotion. I didn't stop. I ran harder, abandoning stealth. I pushed through the hanging meat, the frozen carcasses bruising my shoulders. I saw the exit door ahead. It was marked with a glowing green sign exit. I was 20 feet away. 10, suddenly, the conveyor track overhead groaned. The chain jerked forward. The carcasses in front of the door swung violently, slamming together like a gate closing. They interlocked, their frozen limbs tangling to form a wall of meat. I skidded to a stop, slipping on the icy floor. I was trapped. I turned around. Al was there. He was 10 feet away, leveling the gun at my chest. The thing inside his glass skull was pulsing rapidly, a frantic strobe of purple light. End of the line, Miller, Al grunted. He squeezed the trigger. I dropped to the floor. The green bolt flew over my head, hitting the wall of frozen meat. The carcasses exploded outward, raining chunks of ice and beef. I scrambled forward, grabbing a meat hook that had fallen to the floor. It was heavy, stainless steel, with a wicked curved point. Al racked the slide on his gun, a high-pitched whine indicating it was recharging. I didn't give him the chance. I lunged from the floor, swinging the meat hook with every ounce of desperation I had left. I aimed for his knees. The steel hook bit into Al's leg. But there was no spray of blood, no scream of pain. There was a screech of tearing metal. The hook ripped through his pants leg, exposing what was underneath. It wasn't flesh, it was a hydraulic piston. A gleaming, silver servo motor hissed as hydraulic fluid green, and glowing sprayed onto the ice. Al stumbled, his leg buckling. Damage detected, he stated, his voice losing its human inflection and dropping into a robotic monotone. Rerouting power. I scrambled back, staring at the exposed machinery. You're a robot? I gasped. Al looked down at his damaged leg, then back at me. His glass skull rotated slightly. The brain thing inside spinning. Cyborg, Al corrected. Biomechanical integration, the perfect worker. No fatigue, no complaints, no debt. He raised the gun again, balancing on his good leg. I looked at the hook in my hand, then at the overhead track. The track was powered by a heavy-duty chain drive. Directly above Al's head was the motor housing. I threw the meat hook, not at Al, at the chain. The hook caught in the links. The chain jammed. The motor whined, protesting the sudden stoppage. Sparks showered down from the ceiling. Then, with a crack like a gunshot, the chain snapped. The heavy steel chain whipped downward, lashing out like a striking snake. It hit Al squarely on the glass dome of his skull. Crack! The glass shattered. The thing inside the pulsating brain creature was exposed to the freezing air. It shrieked. A high piercing sound that shattered the remaining icicles in the room. It writhed, turning black as the cold hit it. Illa's body convulsed. He dropped the gun. His arms flailed wildly, smashing into the carcasses around him. Critical error, he screamed, his voice distorting. System shut down, reboot. Reboot, he fell backward, crashing onto the icy floor. The green fluid from his leg pooled around him, melting the frost. I stood over him, panting, the freezing air burning my lungs. The brain creature gave one final twitch and dissolved into a puddle of black sludge. Elisai's human eyes stared up at the ceiling, vacant and dead. I didn't wait to see if he had a backup generator. I turned to the exit door. The wall of meat had been blasted open by LS missed shot. I shoved through the frozen debris and burst through the door. I wasn't outside. I was on the processing floor. The main line. And the nightmare wasn't over. It was just getting started. I burst onto the main processing floor, expecting the silence of a stopped line. Instead, I walked into a mechanical hurricane. The entire factory was running at maximum capacity. The roar was deafening, a cacophony of grinding gears, hissing steam, and the wet slap of meat hitting conveyor belts. But there were no workers, no men in white coats, no inspectors. The machines were running themselves. The overhead rail was moving at a blur, whipping carcasses around corners so fast, they swung out horizontally. The saws were screaming, their blades spinning in a blur of silver violence. The packaging machines were stamping, wrapping, and sealing with rhythmic, pneumatic fury. I had to cross the floor to reach the main loading bay doors. It was 100 yards of lethal machinery. I started running. A circular saw arm swung down from the ceiling, slicing through the air where my head had been a second before. I ducked, sliding under a conveyor belt. Above me, raw steaks marched by in an endless parade. But they weren't steaks. I looked up as I crawled. Through the gaps in the rollers, I saw what was on the belt. They weren't cuts of beef. They were gray, fleshy pods. Like giant beating hearts, they pulsed with a wet, squelching sound. And inside the translucent membrane of each pod, curled in the fetal position, was a small, humanoid creature. They looked like fetuses, but with the faces of adults. I saw a face that looked like my high school math teacher, another that looked like the cashier at the gas station. I scrambled out from under the belt, retching. "What is this?" I screamed, though no one could hear me over the roar. I jumped over a waste trough, narrowly missing a jet of scalding water from an automated cleaning nozzle. "Security breach. Sector 7, the robotic voice echoed from the speakers. Suddenly, the floor grates ahead of me burst open. The livestock from the rendering plant, the things in the black hazmat suits climbed out. They moved like spiders, skittering on all fours, their limbs bending backward. They hissed, their yellow eyes locking onto me. There were 10 of them. Maybe more. They blocked the path to the loading bay. I looked around for a weapon. My bolt gun was gone. The meat hook was back in the freezer. I saw the control panel for the main conveyor system. A big red button labeled emergency stop. But next to it was a lever. Reverse. I sprinted for the panel. The creatures shrieked and charged, their claws clicking on the concrete. One of them leaped, sailing through the air toward me. I slammed the lever down. The main conveyor belt, loaded with thousands of pounds of meat pods, screeched and reversed direction. The sudden change in momentum sent the pods flying. They launched off the belt like missiles, raining down on the charging creatures. The heavy, wet sack slammed into the monsters, knocking them off their feet. The pods burst on impact, covering the creatures in a sticky, amniotic fluid. The creature midair was struck by a flying pod, knocking it sideways into the path of a bandsaw. Zuds! The saw sliced the creature in half. It didn't bleed red. It bled black oil and sparks. I didn't stop to watch. I used the chaos to sprint for the bay doors. I reached the control box for the door. I punched the green button. Nothing happened. The keypad flashed red. Lockdown, I heard a hiss behind me. 3 of the creatures had recovered. They were crawling over the machinery closing in. I looked at the loading bay door. It was solid steel, but next to it was the trash compactor chute. It led outside to the dumpster. It was my only chance. I threw myself into the chute, sliding down the greasy metal slide. "Purge initiated," the computer voice announced. The compactor ram began to descend above me. I slid faster, clawing at the smooth metal. I tumbled out the bottom, landing in a pile of rotting offal and garbage in the dumpster outside. Above me, The compactor slammed shut with a bone-shaking crunch. I scrambled over the side of the dumpster, falling onto the frozen asphalt of the parking lot. The sun was just starting to crack the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. I was out. I was alive, but as I looked back at the plant, I saw the smoke rising from the stacks. It wasn't white steam anymore, it was green, and it formed shapes in the wind. Screaming faces that dissolved into the dawn. I sat in the cab of my truck, shivering uncontrollably. The heater was blasting full bore, but the cold was deep in my bones. It was the kind of cold that comes from shock, from seeing things that rewrite your understanding of reality. My hands were still stained with the dark grease from the dumpster dive. I scrubbed them with a wet wipe, but the stain wouldn't lift. It was like a tattoo of shame. I watched the plant through my windshield. From the outside, it looked perfectly normal. The morning shift was starting to arrive. Cars were pulling into the lot, beat-up sedans and trucks, driven by tired men and women sipping coffee, oblivious to the slaughterhouse of horrors waiting inside. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run out and bang on their windows, to tell them to turn around, to go home, to never come back. But I knew what would happen. They would look at me covered in filth, eyes wild, rambling about cyborgs and human-faced cows, and they would call the police. And the police, who did the police work for in a town owned by the plant? I put the truck in gear and drove. I didn't go home. I drove west, away from Hastings, away from the sunrise. I drove until the fuel light came on. 3 hours later, in a small town in Colorado, I pulled into a diner. I needed to see normal people doing normal things. I sat in a booth in the back, huddled over a mug of black coffee. The waitress, a kindly older woman named Barb, gave me a concerned look, but didn't ask about the smell. "You look like you've been through the ringer, hon," she said, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon in front of me. "On the house, you need the protein." I stared at the bacon, the strips of cured pork sizzling in grease. I thought of the pods on the conveyor belt. I thought of the freezer. My stomach heaved. I pushed the plate away. "Just toast," I whispered. "Please, just toast." Barb nodded and took the plate. I looked out the window. A delivery truck was pulling up to the back of the diner. It was a refrigerated box truck, unloading supplies. My heart stopped. On the side of the truck was a logo, a smiling cartoon cow, giving a thumbs up, and underneath, the slogan, Midwest Prime. Taste the tradition. I knew that logo. It was on the side of the boxes in the freezer. It was the parent company of the plant. I watched as the driver wheeled a dolly of boxes into the diner. He was wearing a uniform, and on his neck, just above the collar, a barcode. It was faint, like a scar, but it was there. I froze. The driver looked up and saw me watching him through the window. He didn't look away. He stared right at me, and then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of the steer. Too wide, too knowing. He tapped his temple with one finger. I scrambled out of the booth, throwing a crumpled $20 bill on the table. I ran out the front door, nearly tripping over my own feet. I jumped into my truck and peeled out of the parking lot. My tires screeching, I drove for another 6 hours, fueled by terror and caffeine pills I bought at a gas station. I finally stopped at a motel in the middle of nowhere. I turned on the television in the room, needing noise to drown out the silence. The news was on. A report about a recall. Midwest Prime has issued a voluntary recall for all ground beef products produced in the Nebraska facility due to possible contamination, the anchor said, her face grave. Consumers are advised to discard any products immediately. In unrelated news, authorities are investigating a fire that broke out at the Hastings facility early this morning. No casualties have been reported, though one employee, Travis Jenkins, remains missing. Not dead missing. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen. They were covering it up. The fire. The recall. It was all a script. And then, a commercial came on. It was for a new burger at a fast food chain. A juicy, sizzling patty on a bun. Made with 100% real beef, the announcer said. The camera zoomed in on the burger. For a split second, a single frame glitch. The texture of the meat changed. It didn't look like ground beef. It looked like a mosaic of tiny screaming faces. I turned off the television. I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. I looked at my neck. There was no barcode. Not yet. But in the reflection behind me, the shower curtain moved. Just a little. I spun around, ripping the curtain back. Empty. But on the porcelain of the tub, written in what looked like grease, was a message. See you soon, Michiganler. I slept in the truck that night. I parked it in an open field, miles from the nearest road, with a shotgun across my lap. I woke up screaming 3 times, dreaming of hooves clattering on the roof. The next morning, I checked my bank account on my phone, praying for enough gas money to get to the coast. I dropped the phone. The balance, which had been negative $400 yesterday, now read $500,000. The deposit was labeled simply, severance NDA $500,000. Enough to pay off my student loans. Enough to pay off the truck. Enough to put Pop in the best care facility in the state for the rest of his life. Enough to buy my silence. I sat there, staring at the screen, tears streaming down my face. I laughed, a dry hacking sound that turned into a sob. They knew I wouldn't go to the police. They knew I wouldn't go to the press. They knew exactly what my price was. They bought my soul for the price of a house. I drove to the nursing home. I walked into Pop's room. He was sitting by the window staring at the birds. "Hey, Pop," I said, my voice cracking. He looked at me. His eyes were clear today. "Hey, son, you look tired, working hard." "Yeah, Pop, working hard." "Good man," he smiled. "Honest work keeps the soul clean." I almost broke down right there. Honest work. "Pop, I'm going to move you to a better place. Somewhere with a garden, somewhere they cook real food." He patted my hand. "That sounds nice, son, but don't spend all your money on me." I squeezed his hand. "It's okay, Pop. I got a bonus." I left him there and went to the bathroom. I washed my face with cold water. As I dried my hands, I saw it. On the paper towel dispenser, a sticker. "Property of Midwest Sanitation Services." And underneath, scribbled in black marker, "We're watching." I ran out of the building. I'm writing this from an internet cafe, in a city I won't name. I've burned my clothes. I've shaved my head. I've changed my name. But I know it doesn't matter. You can't run from the supply chain. It's everywhere. It's in the grocery store. It's in the restaurants. It's in the school cafeterias. Every time you bite into a burger, ask yourself, why is the meat so cheap? Why is it so red? And if you hear a clicking sound in your pipes at night, if you hear a whisper from the drain, don't listen. Run. Because the animals aren't always dead, and sometimes they remember who killed them. If you ever see a package of meat with a batch code ending in 777, put it back. Do not buy it. Do not touch it. That's the batch from the night shift. That's the batch from Pen 4. And whatever you do, never ever look a cow in the eye for longer than 5 seconds.